Welcome to this lesson on the Tableau Certified Data Analyst exam. Today we're going to be talking about customizing fields, and there are subtopics under this topic. So what we're going to cover here is changing the default properties, then renaming columns, choosing when to convert between discrete and continuous, and choosing to convert between dimension and measure, and finally creating aliases. Before we get into it, I want to take a look at the documentation, and I'm going to be placing links to all of these documents from Tableau under the video. So here's changing the default settings, renaming fields, converting between discrete and continuous, and converting between dimension and measure. Finally, we have documentation on creating aliases. It says rename members in the view, but don't be distracted by that. Really, creating aliases is the topic, and renaming members is what creating aliases does, rather than renaming the field itself. We're also going to talk about that. Pro tip, if you find I'm going too quickly or too slowly, adjust the video speed as needed. We're going to start talking about default properties. So first, there are a set of properties that you get when you're looking at a dimension. So here we can set a comment, color, shape, and sort. So those are the properties for a dimension. The properties are not the same as for a measure. We see with a measure, we have comment, color, number format, aggregation, and total using. If you think about it, this logically makes sense. If it's a measure, it's something that gets aggregated when you add it to the view. You can set how you want it to be aggregated. It also can have totals if you show the totals, and then you can decide how you want those totals to be calculated. It makes sense that you have those two options for measures, but not for dimensions. And as far as, for example, shape is only available for dimension. If you think about it, dimension has like a limited number of specific values, and so you can associate shapes with those different values, whereas in measures, it's just a number, and so if you have a million numbers, you're not going to have a different shape for all million numbers, right? So it kind of doesn't make sense to set shapes on measures. So intuitively, these options make sense. With a color, you could have a color gradient that would cover a continuous measure, and so it makes sense to have a color associated there. And we're going to look at these in the demo later. This gives you a sense of what the default properties are, and so to access these, you would go to the data pane, right-click on the field you're interested in changing the properties for, and then set them there. Now let's take a look at converting from a measure to a dimension. To convert from a measure to a dimension will mean that when you put the values in the view, they will no longer be aggregated. Because the difference between a measure and a dimension is, with a measure, you aggregate when you add it to the view. With a dimension, you add detail to the view. That basically switching from one to the other will change how it behaves when it's added to the view. Does it get aggregated or does it add detail to the view? Now, how do you actually do this? One way is to drag the field from the measures area in the data pane to the dimensions area, or vice versa. And that would do the conversion. So you could just physically kind of click and then move the field over, or you could right click and change it as well. And so we'll see that during the demo. Now let's talk about discrete to continuous. So the big difference between continuous and discrete is between a continuous axis and headers. Continuous fields will have an axis. Discrete fields will have headers. A discrete date can be converted to continuous, but you can't switch a string. So you can't have a continuous string. Logically speaking, that doesn't really make sense that you would have a continuous variable that's also a word, right? A bunch of words. A continuous thing is a concept that really applies to numbers and dates. So there can be a range of values on a date or a range of values on a number. Last, let's look at creating aliases before we go into the demo. And so for creating aliases, that's where we give a name to the field values that's different from what's in the data, so that when we display it, those are the values that are displayed. And to do this, we would right-click on the field in the data pane and then select aliases. Then we would edit the alias, make our edits to whichever values we want to be associated with a different alias, make those changes, and then select OK. Now I'm going to go into Tableau and show you how I do these things. So let's start out looking at order date, right-click, and go to default properties. And so here, date format, I can change how the date is represented when it's added to the view. So I could do a short date like this. And that doesn't make much of a difference when I'm just doing this, but if I go to like exact date, now I see it's represented as month, day, year. Let's try removing it and then change this to default properties, date format. Let's switch it to long date. Add it to the view and then switch over to exact date. And so here now I see values like Monday, comma, November 6th, 2017. So the appearance has changed. I'm now going to try adding a default comment. So I go over to here, right click, default properties, comment. This is the date that the order was placed. And now when I mouse over this, that's what pops up. I get a, this is the date that the order was placed. This is the date that the order was placed. So I see it here as the default comment. Let's try a different field. So this is a date field. Let's try segment. So if I right click on segment, default properties, I can do shape. Default properties, shape. Set to this strange one, assign palette. Apply, and I'm going to double click segment to add it to the view, and now I do get these funny shapes, right? These particular ones don't really go with the option that I have, but I could set a different set of shapes that are appropriate for these segments. Color, also an option. So we associate these colors by default, but if we wanted to change consumer to pink, do that. If I drag segment over to color, I'm going to see these different colors that I've just said doesn't really look too good as a scatter plot. But if I had, say, a bar chart here with these different colors, stacked bar chart with the order date maybe here, right? Then you have these different color lines. So that is looking at some dimensions. Now I'm going to look at the measures. Right-clicking on profit, I can do change data type, default properties, aggregation, and by default it's going to be a sum. And we see that here, it's sum profit, but I can change it so that it is aggregating by the average. So if I remove profit and then I add it again, now I'm going to get the average profit instead of the total profit, the sum of the profit by default. Of course, I can always switch it again, but that's not changing the default property. The default is when I click it, how's it going to come into the view initially? So I just changed that. If I go to default properties color, now I get a color gradient. And so I can change the default color gradient that shows up for this. For example, if I have a map like this and I add profit, do a fill map, this is defined by the color gradient that I've chosen for profit. In this case, it's the default. But if I remove it, right click, default properties, color, I can set, let's choose one that's kind of weird, a gray one. Now double click and switch over to fill map, and we see a gray map. So those are the default properties. Took a look at most of them. Next, I'd like to look at renaming a field. This is really the easiest concept we're going to talk about. So you just move over to the field name, right click, say rename. And then if I want to change it from customer name to customer full name, I would go like that. And you can see it come in on a new sheet where that's now the header. So that's pretty simple. Not much more to say about it. Next, let's take a look at continuous versus discrete. I'm going to start a new worksheet here, and I'm going to add ship date to the view. And I'll just drill down into that a little bit like this. And so I have now this header that goes across. And I'm going to add maybe, let's do sales by month. And I can change that over to like a line graph like this. Now, because I chose this, it actually switched it to an axis and made this behave as a continuous field. And so you see this axis down here, but if I switch it to discrete, you see individual values for the headers, right? These are headers rather than an axis. Each value, each month is represented here. It's not an axis, it's headers. And so that's the distinction between discrete and continuous with a measure. With a measure, you're going to see individual headers for individual values versus with when it's discrete versus when you make it continuous, you're going to see an axis. That's with a date. We can also look at what happens when we do it with profit. So right now, profit is continuous. We put it in and we get this scatter chart with profit here, the axis for profit, and here we have the axis for sales. If I switch profit to being discrete, now I'm doing this not in the default properties, but just in general, then I get a single value here for profit. It's the average value of profit because that's the default that I put in before. I could switch it to sum. But the point is I only get a single value summing up profit, and then I get this value for sales, right? This axis for sales, because sales is still continuous. So that's continuous versus discrete for dates and also for measures. Now, if I try and go over to product name, I can't switch that one to be continuous. It's automatically only discrete because it's a string. You can't make that kind of change on a string. So that's continuous versus discrete. Now let's look at dimensions versus measure. I'm going to start again a new worksheet, and there's a couple ways to change this. So if I just drag sales over here, then it becomes a dimension. When I add it, instead of aggregating, it's not going to aggregate. The individual values will be added to the view. And so that's going to create a whole lot of values. So you see every single value here, and that's because sales is now behaving as a dimension. I can drag it back, and now sales is behaving as a measure again. And so when you add it to the view, it gets aggregated. If you drag it over to dimensions and you add it to the view, you see each individual value, they're not summed up anymore. So that's one way to make the change. The other way is just to right click and say convert to dimension, and now it just pops over. And then you can right click and convert to measure. And we can do the same with other values, but we cannot, again, change strings to measures, right? It's not going to work, except that it will do like a count distinct on that. So, or just a count. So I'm going to try with product name. And so now it pops over here and it says, okay, I'm going to give you the count, the distinct count of the product name. And that's the field now. So I can see this is how many products I have. If I add product subcategory, I see how many products I have in each subcategory. That's what happens when you change like a string that's over in your dimensions into a measure, is it automatically does that like count distinct thing with it. So that's switching between dimension and a measure. Right click on a date. Let's try this with a date. So with a date, we can't move it over to be a measure. It won't go over there. So right click, no, will not. We can change it from continuous to discrete, but not from discrete to measure. Next up, let's talk about creating aliases. The screenshot was pretty self-explanatory, but I'm just going to give the example here. So I'm going to go to aliases, and then I'll change corporate to company. Now I'm going to add segment. And so instead of corporate appearing, I see company. And so that is the purpose of an alias. So it's different from renaming a column where you're changing the field name. Here you're basically giving new labels to the field values rather than the field name. So it's not changing the metadata, the field name. It's changing the data itself by adding a new label to the existing value. And so those are the topics under this customized field subject. And this closes out the discussion we had of basically the first part of the data analyst exam, which is connecting to data sources. And so in the next section, we'll be starting to look at how to explore and analyze data after you've established that connection. Use Tableau Prep to clean up the data. How do you start actually exploring and analyzing the data with calculations, with year over year, other things. And so that's it for now, but stay tuned for more on the data analyst exam.